point, actually. Yeah, we'll incorporate that in.
Thank you. Any other questions for Matthew on this report? Again, on any of the items? Can't see any, Matthew. I think you're. Are we happy to? We're asked to note this report, presumably. People happy to note the report and move on?
Yeah, happy with that.
Yep. Okay, Matthew.
Yeah,
then
with that.
Yeah.
Item 6, then, which is the risk management policy and risk register.
We now move into a number of policies. So again, I suppose this, thank you, Sean. I think on page 65 of your packs is is my covering report with regard to this, and there's a number of items within this here. Now, the risk management policy was something that was proposed as part of the governance review, and it was identified under the governance review that Aon did that actually good governance actually prescribed that the fund or a fund should actually have an overarching risk management policy. There are degrees, and we have captured in the past areas of risk. So the investment strategy statement will have a risk section within it, but that is specific to the investment risk side. The funding strategy statement also had a risk aspect in, but that was in respect of the prescriptive funding risk. So there wasn't really an overarching risk management framework that incorporated kind of risk management within there. So what this policy is designed to do is actually provide a framework about actually what is risk, what's the aims and objectives of the fund in respect of risk, what is its philosophy on risk management, how it monitors and measures that risk, how it identifies those risks, and what mitigations and controls are actually in place around that. So it's actually looking at kind of controlling all of those aspects of risk. I think the one thing to say is obviously we don't live in a risk-free environment, so it's always about actually we will be operating with degrees of risk in a couple of areas, but how do we actually monitor and maintain that? Now, ultimately, the risk management policy and the risk register will be one of the key component parts with regard to this. So what we have done as part of this exercise is actually look at the philosophy of the risks, how we identify and how we monitor those risks. So I think on page 75 is giving how we are looking at assessing risk moving forward. So 75 and 76 within the risk management policy gives I think pretty much an industry standard. They're different variations. You can use a 4 and 4 or a 4 and 3 and a 5, 1 to 5. What we've actually done here is replicated what the Gloucestershire County Council has actually adopted. So the members on Pensions Committee, the elected members on Pensions Committee, are used to seeing risk registers throughout their time within the council. So what we've done is replicate what they would see in other areas rather than actually come up with our own in terms of the areas. However, what we have done is within those categorizations being specific of what that actually means to pensions. So later on, I think it's on pages 79 and 80, actually gives some examples of what we are doing in terms of assessing what would actually fit within those categorizations. So it hopefully gives an expectation of actually what will actually how we will assess risk, and then what actually some of those aspects will mean, and whether then they are ragged, red, amber, or green moving forward in terms of that. In terms of reporting, obviously this is something that will go to committee on an ongoing basis and to the board, and is one of the key things for to be looked at on an ongoing basis on that side. So if we actually look you're hopefully aware of the existing risk register, which is still attached at this moment in time, and we will look at that in a moment. But ultimately, what we're also then trying to do is provide something that is maybe slightly easier to deal with in terms of that. So on page 83 is an example of what we are looking at delivering for committee and yourselves in the future. So page 83 is a heat map, which is provided over those three particular main areas that we will actually then categorize our risks in: to funding and investment risks, to the administration and communication, and to governance risks. So we will put those three categories together and put the associated risks to those three areas together. We will then map where those risks are sitting, so you can actually see if you're outside of your risk tolerances. Now, as part of the request from committee, which we're still working through, there is a request also to have some kind of bar chart about how many risks that you've got in each of those categories, how many are in scope and how many are out of scope. So there's a metric, and a very easy metric to actually see if there is a particular area where you may be a little bit more out of kilter in terms of the total numbers, rather than trying to add up the number of squares and the number of boxes. And we're looking to actually deliver that as part of the rollout on this side. So hopefully you'll be able to kind of see that what we're trying to produce is something that visually people can actually pick up very, very quickly and actually see and focus down on the risks that they need to be aware of if they are operating outside of their tolerances. On page 84 is then also an example, and we've just got the example at this point of just one singular risk that we took, where we were a little bit more focused on the risks, the likelihood, and how we will be providing information on each of those particular risks moving forward in comparison to what we currently do. So what we will also have is a target risk. So, where are we comfortable, or where is it comfortable that it's been set that risk and operating? So going back to my earlier comment that we will always have risks, but where are we comfortable with setting that risk target for that particular activity? So hopefully we'll see that we're bringing on the degree of how we're assessing those risks and looking at those risks moving forward. So that's really covered in page 84. And then the last part from myself is actually from page 85 onwards is the existing risk register that was reviewed by committee and is being passed to yourselves here. So again, just really an update of where we have on those particular risks. Now, if you recall, at the last board meeting, it was proposed that risk G7, it was a request from the board that risk was to be increased back up to a level in terms of the knowledge and skills. We took that back to committee and they agreed to re-elevate that particular risk around the impact of the training and the experience until the training plan had actually been delivered and we were further back into there. So committee actually appreciated that feedback from the board in terms of that particular risk, and that one remains elevated at that particular time and has gone back up. The committee approved and adopted the new risk register and approved the risk management framework. They did ask for one addition to be added, which was a definition of risk, which I did incorporate, and it is incorporated into the version that you actually have in front of you here. So on page 70, there is a paragraph which actually defines a definition of risk within there. So that was a request that was actually made by committee to incorporate that, and that has been done. So what you have in front of you is the policy that's been approved by committee in terms of the risk management. They have agreed the adoption of the risk register and the heat map, and I think that they were appreciative of the way that will be coming through. And now obviously it's for ourselves to go and actually map our existing risks into the new risk register. As part of that process, as I do that, just to let you know, we will also then be doing and issuing that to the investment advisor, John Arthur, and to Julie as the actuary, to ensure that from their perspective, as the advisors to the fund, we are capturing all of the risks that they would perceive that we should be capturing on that risk register as well. So as part of that next process, they will input into that risk register at that point in time. So predominantly at the next board meeting, we should have a new risk register to look at with it in the new format moving forward. So on that, Sean, I'll stop there and take any questions on any of that.
I mean, risk has been an area that the board has focused on a lot, I think, over the life of the board. I think this is probably a really important report for the board to be looking at and being comfortable that the policy is comprehensive and people are happy with the criteria in that policy as well. And then I think the only questions about whether the presentation is helpful in terms of particular heat map, which is new, and then the changes to the risk register. So, I mean, if we take the policy first, have people got any questions on the policy, and are they happy with the criteria, which I can't remember, Matthew, what pages you said they were on. I think there's the definitions of what the different levels of risk are, what's critical, what's severe, and then the definitions of what's rare and what's almost certain.
Yeah, so page 75 gives you the methodology of like the impact versus the likelihood and how we then assess that. And then what we've then done is then given it's specific in relation to pensions activity and the funds activity about what we would consider to be a critical event or an insignificant event that is actually then so when we're actually assessing it, and I think this is where the area of challenge could be about somebody's, because ultimately it will be an interpretation of an individual about what a potential impact will be. That's when we map it through to this, it's actually understanding at the next stage that, you know, you set that risk at moderate. Is that only, you know, is it a moderate financial loss or is it a major financial loss? And I think that's where the subjectivity will come in and the challenge potentially will come in to make sure that we actually categorize all of those risks appropriately as they change. Because obviously as regulation changes, things will change in terms of those impacts. So it's just trying to actually put some metric around how we make that assessment and what is classified as a critical versus a major or moderate or minor or insignificant in these particular examples.
And I assume, Matthew, that if there's only a moderate financial risk, but it's going to lead to a public inquiry, then that would be deemed as critical. So it's the higher of the...
Exactly, yes. Yeah, it will be the highest kind of impact will denote the level that it will be set to rather than that. So yes, if it was, in your example, a moderate financial loss, but it was actually reputationally something that was going to lead to a public inquiry, obviously that would be deemed as critical at that particular side, you know.
In terms of presentation, will that be repeated as front page of the risk register every quarter as a helpful reminder?
What the criteria for assessing? Yeah. Actually, that's a very good. That's a very good point. Potentially, what I'll do is add it to an appendix page to that, so it actually accompanies the risk register at all times. So we will put those. I hadn't even thought of that yet as we were actually going through as the creation of it. But I think the appendix 1 on page 79 and page 80, we will make sure is attached to the full risk register as a key on the back page. So there's a reference back to that all time, so people don't have to then try and find the policy to find out what critical actually means. I think that's a good point, Sean.
And I think it's really
what you were saying,
people what it is, so that when they're looking at individual risks, they can refer back to that.
Yeah. And I think one of the intentions also as we do this is, as you can see, hopefully from the risk that we've put, the example of the risks that we've put there, if you look at the comparison to the risks that we currently have on our risk register, they are very, very wordy. and you know, on that side. So we are going to be trying to be more specific in terms of those salient points. So it's actually easier for the reader to kind of deal with the number of risks that we have. We'll also look at potentially combinations of some of those risks. So as we do this next stage of the work, what I'm attempting to try and do is that we'll take the existing risk register, and when you receive the new risk register, I will have a mapping of the existing risks, or a narrative about why that risk is no longer applicable, or whether or not it's being combined with others as we go through. So hopefully for both yourself and committee, we'll have some comfort that we've done that assessment risk and actually taken the current risk register and remap that across, and how that's actually operated, so you can actually see, rather than actually having to kind of relook at the entire thing as a complete standalone new piece of work.
Okay.
I think that's a good idea. When I look at this register, I kind of, as most people probably do, you look at the right hand, the residual risk column, and see, are there any red ones? No, good. Are there any ambers? And what's being done about those? And I see there's parts where you've written in red, actions have been taken, which is good. So you know what's being taken to improve things, what actions have been taken. That's not always there. Like, it would be handy to have a clearer indication of what has been done over the last period to reduce risks for every category. I'm sure it's a matter of presentation as much as anything. That's my initial comment.
Okay, yeah, thank you, John. I think moving forward, I would suspect, because obviously, you know, from my perspective, when I look at residual risk, it says where the risk is currently set, but it doesn't actually give you a target. And I think that's what we've tried to put in there. So in the future, what hopefully you should be expecting, and hopefully what we'll be delivering, is that if a risk is out of target, what is the risk mitigation plan? What is your plan of action to actually look at that risk? What are you doing? So there'll be a narrative around any of those risks that are outside of the tolerance levels. So we will be providing that narrative to yourselves, so it's really, really clear. Because at the moment, yes, you know, if I look at, say, a particular risk where there is some red narrative on it, at the moment, the risk register says, well, that's the inherent risk, that's the residual risk. Yes, there's been some action, but is that within your risk tolerance, or is it not in your risk tolerance? So I think that was the bit for me that was missing from that. So now what we can actually do is become a little bit more focused and actually assess and make sure that those risks that are outside of those tolerances, what risk plans have you got in place? What mitigations, what actions are you taking to actually deal with that, which hopefully will make your role and responsibility a little bit easier, because you can hone straight into those and go, right, Matthew, what are you doing about this, you know, in the future?
Certainly having the heat map is going to make it a lot easier to identify where we've got issues. So if we've got something that its target is green and it's set in red, that says to me we need a plan of action for that pretty quickly.
Yeah,
and it's a very useful visual sort of tool that you say, right, these are the risks that we've got problems with that we need to be addressing as soon as possible.
Yeah, so I think alongside this, I would suspect that what I will do is develop a kind of a standard template report that will capture any risks outside of risk tolerance, and then have narrative around it that will accompany this documentation. So hopefully what you'll get is the heat map. You'll get obviously the detailed risk register underneath, hopefully slightly cut down version, more succinct to what you've got there. And then what you'll then have is a framework or a paper around you know, all of those actions, how those those outside of their tolerances are being dealt with, and what the plans are around them. And that's those three key documents should then bring everything together and be able to be a little bit easier for everybody to focus down on those particular issues that we've got.
Sounds good. Thanks, Matthew.
Can I just say something in terms of presentation, Matthew? I agree with Michael, the heat map, a good idea, and focuses the mind quite quickly on what you want to look at. Just to the proposed risk register below, I think the smiley face is a step too far, if I'm honest, or the unsmiley face, because actually when I first looked at it, I saw green and then saw an unhappy face, and I thought, oh, what's going on there? But actually, it's not green, it's amber, and, you know, I think, you know, probably, I think colours and heat maps are probably fine, but it's just a point in presentation, if I'm honest. But yeah, maybe a step too far for me.
Okay. So no smiley faces.
Because on that example, Matthew, I'm assuming because it's the target's green and it's currently at amber, we should have had actions in words in the columns that talked about date not met, target for date to be met, and further actions to be taken. And if this was a real risk register, we would have real concerns that there's something that's not a target, and yet there's no action to mitigate this.
Yes, exactly.
So this would be an example of something that would be really concerning to the pension board.
Yes.
If this appears on the real version.
Yes, if this appeared on the real version, you're outside your risk tolerance and there's no actions and there's no ownership of that action or anything else that's going on. Yeah, that would be the material concern that you would have.
Yeah, or no timelines.
Yes.
Okay, people happy with the policy and the revised presentation of the risk register and the introduction of the heat map? Subject to the comment made already.
Yeah, happy with that.
I'm
happy. And I think having that summary of the areas that are outside of tolerance will help support and strengthen this. So yeah, I'm happy.
Okay. So I think subject to those comments, Matthew, I think we're very happy with the policy, and again, to note what's been proposed. People are therefore happy to move on to item 7, which is the reporting and recording breaches of law policy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so again, cover report starts on page 99. I think to start with, to say that the fund did have a breaches policy, but as part of the overall review, we just it was easier to actually just bring a complete and rework from beginning a complete new policy to ensure that it was compliant with regulations and other parts on that side. So the full reporting and recording breaches of law policy starts on page 101. Fundamentally, it's exactly the same as the policy that was there before. It covers the same thing. It statutorily has to on that, but it just needed to update to make sure that it was compliant with the current levels of regulations and the different pensions acts that we actually have in place. It is ultimately this policy is there to actually assist individuals, yourselves, pensions committee members and members in identifying what are breaches, and then also having a route of, if you feel that there is a potential breach, what you then would need to do in terms of the reporting and the responsibilities for yourselves within that. So it's a policy there that's to assist all parties, yourself, pensions committee members, and everything in discharging your duties around any identified breaches of law and how you would go about reporting those and what is actually needed from that side. So again, hopefully it's something that is not unknown, to yourselves in there. What will be coming through is actually the reporting and recording of breaches. So I think there is an example within here, I think on page 116, of a log and a breaches log that will actually be provided. Now, what in the future, what we will be doing is reporting and bringing that back as a standing item in that first agenda point that we talked about, the fund update. So within there, that will be reported to committee and will be onwardly reported to yourselves as the board. So what you'll actually see are any breaches that are being reported within the previous 12 months and ongoing will be reported to you on an ongoing basis and be a standing item. So even if there haven't been any breaches, you'll know that there haven't been any breaches because we'll come back with a nil return on those particular breaches moving forward. So again, this is just really kind of as part of the governance review, is about good governance. It's about kind of highlighting when we were talking earlier about the statutory requirements. Is the fund meeting its obligations? This would be the way that we would actually be able to determine whether or not the fund is actually meeting its statutory requirements. And if it wasn't, what those implications would be, and if they are being reported, and what those mitigations and actions are. And ultimately, whether or not they need to be assessed and then escalated accordingly from there. So the report contains information about how you identify breaches, what constitutes a breach, and then how you would go through the process and who is responsible for that. Because ultimately, we are all responsible within our actions if we identify something to actually report it on that side. So again, Sean, I'll stop there and open up for any questions with regard to this particular policy, which again was approved by committee at their meeting. There wasn't any additions or amendments made. So the report and the policy you have in front of you is exactly the same as that was tabled and approved at committee on the 3rd of December. Thank you, Sean.
I think this is clearly a key issue for the board, given our statutory duty to monitor the performance of the committee to ensure there are no regulatory breaches. So I think this is a key area for us. I welcome the inclusion of the log every quarter. People happy with the policy itself in terms of what it's setting out?
Yeah, it's fine by me.
Yeah,
It covers their own role as members of the board.
Yeah, I think page 103 in terms of the background explains that the following persons or other persons have responsibility to report breaches of the law, and that includes obviously all members of the Pensions Committee and Pensions Board. So, you know, it is a responsibility as part of your role that if you have identified any breaches, that you would then look towards this policy. This policy is published on the fund's website, so it's accessible, as all of our policies are published on the pension fund website and on the pension fund page. So it is open and transparent in terms of the policy that we would follow, and it's there for yourselves to actually be able to pick up and follow if you've identified a particular breach. So you know the steps that you would need to take in terms of that as well. What we will be doing at some point in the not too distant future, as part of the training plan, we will bring in some training with regard to this, and we will have a training session about what are breaches, what is the impact of the effect, and we will actually provide you. And we're also going to do the same with committee, so it'll be the same training that we'll provide around actually, what breaches are, what you need to do. So we will actually provide some training around this policy and build that into the training plan over the next 12 months.
I think the two key issues for this board are, one, are we capable of recognising a breach? And then secondly, if we recognise one, do we know what to do about it? And I think the policy here sets out exactly what it is that we should do about it. And then maybe the training will also help us make sure we recognise what a breach is. I think the simple question today is having read the policy, are people happy that they would know exactly what to do in the event they suspected a breach? If they are, then I think the policy is doing its job.
Yep. Personally, I think I don't really know where I'd find out about a breach, apart from in this meeting, by which time everyone would be aware of it by definition because it's on the agenda. But I think the policy is fine. There's a kind of working document. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, I think, John, that comes back to some of the comments we were saying earlier about the admin report in terms of making sure that there's performance monitoring against statutory standards, so that we're sure the committee is measuring its own performance against its statutory duties. Because that would indicate a breach if we had a set of performance reports that all showed that everything was being done outside the statutory deadlines. So I think part of the onus on us as a board is to look at, are the committee monitoring all areas where they've got statutory duties? Are the performance reports on these areas? Have we got access to them as members of the board to ensure the committee are reviewing it? And if we find something that the committee have ignored, where we believe is a statutory breach, then we would use this policy to follow up on it.
Yeah.
So
I mean, one of the takeaways,
correct information.
one of the main things I took away from the recent training was that although a lot of the content of these meetings are about investments, you know, I'm not saying it's inappropriate, but really what we were told in the training was that the pensions board has a kind of fairly limited responsibility in terms of investments. It should be more concerned with things like administration. So I think breaches of law policy and the risk register, two things which I think personally I'm going to focus on and go through in detail in advance of every meeting, which I think I haven't done before. There's so much stuff on the agenda, it's difficult to know what to.
Yeah, I would endorse that, John.
Those two areas. Yeah.
So I think, unless there's any further comment, people are happy that the policy is clear. And whilst it's always an area we can learn more, we think the policy itself is clear. As we recognise breaches, we know what to do about them.
Yep. And training as always will help.
Yeah. So Stephen, you got a hand up.
John was quite correct that we should be more involved in the running of the pension group rather than the actual mechanics of doing it. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I understood your point, Stephen.
We're not actually all that involved in running the pension fund, but we are involved in how it is run. I've got that wrong again, haven't I? We are.
I know what you mean.
3 steps back, as it were.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. Our job is to make sure the committee is running it properly.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And that's what you're saying, isn't it? Yeah. They're responsible for making sure it happens. We're responsible for making sure that they're doing their job in accordance with the regulations.
Yes. But that's a bit more difficult, isn't it?
It's challenging, definitely, but I think, what we're looking for is to ensure we're getting sufficient information from the officers so that we can identify that the committee is acting in accordance with its statutory duties.
Yeah.
So I think that, which is why I said, going back to the point that Annette made earlier, it was really important that performance monitoring does reflect the statutory responsibilities, because that then helps us at a glance identify if there's any potential breaches. I think as we learn more, the question is are there any other areas where we think we need more information to help us identify risks of statutory breaches? Are people happy to conclude on this item?
Yes. Sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. We were asked to note the report, and I think we do so. I think welcome it, Matthew.
Sorry. Next one.
8, Statement of Administering Authority Discretions Policy.
And I will apologise, obviously, for the length of the papers. For unfortunately, this is just the sheer volume of policies that we have. But I think this is kind of going back to Sean's point, the key part of, the role of the board to ensure that these are in place. So this will kind of give that framework of how then the committee operate. So the next one that we had was the Statement of Administering Authority Discretions Policy. My cover report again starts on page 119 in there. The actual discretions policy starts on page 122 and covers a number of discretionary policies that the administering authority actually sets about how it will apply the regulations, so it is fair and equitable to all parties, so people would know how to expect and what to expect in terms of the decision making that is made on the fund and how the fund actually applies. Now, the fund did have a discretions policy. It was last reviewed in 1991, so it needed a little bit of an update up on there to make sure it complied with the regulations as we move forward. So it was drafted to make sure that it was actually covering all of the key strategic policies in terms of the regulations that it had. It also covers a number of discretions for the employers as well about how the fund will operate and how it will actually put itself through. Fundamentally, it reflected how the fund was actually being operated in terms of a number of these particular areas and how discretions within the fund were actually being applied on their side. Now, there were some amendments, some minor amendments to it. So I think reference number 45, I think, is one that we just need to, where is it, number 45, which is on page 130 of your page. Now, the committee received an agenda item earlier in their meeting on the 3rd of December with regard to the abatement of pensions. And the fund was still applying abatement to retirees or pensioners of the fund. And what ultimately abatement was basically if a retired member returns to employment within local government with access to the LGPS, you would reduce their pension so their pay and their pension didn't exceed what they previously earned. Now, when the pandemic hit, the COVID pandemic hit, it was requested by the Scheme Advisory Board and by government that funds that still applied abatement to certain proportions of pensions actually ceased, because they wanted people to return to work, but they didn't want them to be financially impeded by doing that to actually aid with the pandemic. Now, very quickly, abatement doesn't apply if they actually went and worked elsewhere that wasn't attached to local government. It only applies to pensions pre-2014. So you are no longer allowed to abate a pension for anybody that was earned post-2014. So there was an anomaly. It was a historical part of the regulations. As part of the process, the Scheme Advisory Board also did a survey of other pension funds, and the vast majority no longer applied abatements, because it was just felt that what it was actually doing was restricting the ability of an authority to actually recruit the right person for a job, because they might not want to come back into local authority if they were going to receive a reduced pension. So committee agreed that what it would do is that for all future retirees, that abatement would no longer be applied. So now the policy is of the particular fund, and that discretion was changed, that we would no longer now apply abatement to any of the pension entitlement pre-14. Obviously, we couldn't do for post-14 retirees anyway. So hopefully, it just means that the workforce is now able to come back in, and the right people, if they wish to return to employment, would be able to do that without any financial detriment to themselves in terms of their pension entitlements that they would have built up. So that was one of the major changes. The only other one really from an operational perspective that changed was reference 12 to 15, and this applied to admitted bodies and admission agreements. I think historically, when the previous discretions policy was put in place, there wasn't that many admission agreements that were being drafted at that point. This, remember, was back in the 1990s when that wasn't really the case. So if there was, it was an experience that happened very, very rarely. That contracts of services would be being put out by the employers. There was limited number of employers obviously attached to the fund at that point in time. So any admission agreement would actually go to committee for their approval before actually you could actually do anything. Now, we obviously work on a quarterly cycle, so it can have an impact in terms of the turnaround. From an operational perspective now, the admission agreement is now something that will be applied by myself as head of pensions and agreed within the protocols, taking the legal advice and putting those admission agreements in place. So it doesn't need to go to committee. However, committee will be reported to about new admitted bodies and those admitted bodies that are leaving as well, because that's something that isn't reported at the moment. So all employer activity will now form part of that fund update as well, of where employers and new employers are coming onto the fund, and obviously when employers are leaving the fund as well. So there is a true picture of employer activity that goes back to committee and yourselves on an ongoing basis, so you can actually see that level of activity that's moving forward. Outside of that, I think that the policy is there. And again, this is published on the website, on the fund's website, so all members and all employers can actually see how the fund will discharge its discretions in respect of the regulations on a fair and equitable basis. So all members should and employers will know what to expect and in what particular areas on that side. So I'll stop there, Sean, and hand back for any questions.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Matthew on this item?
Could I just ask one? Sorry.
John, yeah.
Just in terms of the 12 to 15, obviously it's sensible to make those amendments, but will there be any reporting back to the committee or the board on what omissions have been accepted or removed or taken away? I absolutely agree. It makes absolute practical sense, and as you know, I've been asking for some myself, so that's fine. But I suppose it's just a matter of, will there be some sort of reporting of new emissions or ones where they've ended, etc., etc.?
Absolutely, John. That will be reported on a quarterly basis as part of the fund update. So all employer activity. So if there are any new admission bodies, they will be notified to both committee and board. And any employers that have ceased participation in the fund will also be advised to committee and board as well. So that will be a standing item on that quarterly report.
Thanks, Matthew.
Okay. Any other questions for Matthew on this one?
No? Not from me, no.
Okay, we're asked to note the report. People have to do so.
Yep, fine by me.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. To move us on then to item 9, the pensions arrangements for outsourced services.
Yep, thank you. So the last one of these major items, your papers have been reversed. So you've got the appendix first, and then my covering report at the end. So the covering report is on page 147 to 150, and then you've got the detail around the outsourcing and the potential use of pass-through. So if I look at the covering report, what the report actually that was taken to committee and committee approved was actually a preferred option of the fund in respect of outsourcing. So in respect of admission bodies and in respect of how the employers would awarding authorities would then look to operate with their contractors, and the impact and the effect that would actually have on the pension fund. So what this report was actually designed to do was to actually look at the potential options and actually for the fund to give a preferred solution of what the fund would prefer to do. Now, ultimately, how a contractor is admitted to the fund is still a responsibility of the awarding authority. So whether that's an academy, a district council, county council, or whoever, it's down to the awarding authority to determine the basis of which they wish that contractor to actually be admitted to the fund. Ultimately, it will have to incorporate within regulations, and then the fund would accept that contractor, bearing in mind all the legal agreements that would then be drafted in accordance with the way that people would actually come through. So ultimately, the way that the majority of contractors have been coming onto the pension fund, onto the Gloucestershire Fund, historically, has always been on what we call a fully funded basis. So a contract would be put out, the contractor would take on the assets and liabilities of that particular workforce. So they would take on a position that would be fully funded at the point that they took on that contract, and they would be responsible for the assets and then ultimately the liabilities for that cohort of the population. Now, what we were also finding is that as part of that process, we would then also as a fund require a bond to be put in place to actually cover the financial position that may or may not be there for the contractor at the end of that contract. Within the COVID pandemic, the bond market has pretty much ceased to exist, and we were finding that contractors were having difficulty in securing those financial bonds that were being required. So we were looking at different ways of which contractors could actually be admitted to the fund. And what we were seeing was that within the LGPS, and especially in respect of the exit credit regulations, which came into force as well, is that the use of pass-through was becoming much more prevalent within the LGPS, and was something that actually, for a number of the contracts that are being supplied and the admission authorities that are coming on board, would actually be a better outcome, because ultimately the awarding authority would stand behind those within the regulations, stand behind the liabilities as the funder of last resort anyway. So actually allowing those liabilities to remain with the awarding authority for the term of the contract actually had certainly some advantages on that side. So the fund looked at that, and we took advice from the fund's actuary on the process in terms of it. Within the funding strategy statement, we don't need to revise the funding strategy statement to come out with the preferred option of the particular fund at this time. It is captured within there because it was in there from the awarding authority. But the fund actually and the committee decided that what it would do was actually put that preference out, that actually the preferred way and the route for contractors coming on board would be to utilise pass-through moving forward. So as part of that, we are working with the actuary, and I have it to my right-hand side at the moment, and we have got a guidance note that we will be issuing to all of the employers, so the academies, the districts, about the new preferred option and the routes and the ways to actually go through. But as I said, it's still down to the awarding authority to determine the way that it actually wished to actually work with the contractors moving forward. So this gives a preference for what the fund would like to see. From an administrative perspective, makes it easier. From the awarding authority's perspective, should hopefully mean that you're getting better quality or better costings in terms of the contracts that will go out, and also it will reduce costs, or certainly on the contractors in terms of actuarial costs. It also avoids the ability for the contractors to then need to account for those pension liabilities on their balance sheet. So the accounting standards wouldn't apply because they wouldn't have those liabilities moving forward. And it gives a greater degree of certainty. And also what it also does as well from the exit credit perspective would stop the contractor actually potentially receiving an exit credit to take advantage of, say, market returns. And the experience of market returns, where it could be seen that the contractor might end up getting an exit credit payment that would be in excess of the contributions that they paid in for the duration of the contract, which may be a perverse outcome, but is something that is certainly could actually be the case, which I'm not sure that either the contractor or the awarding authority would actually be wanting to go into an agreement where that particular scenario would exist. So the preferred option is there. We are delivering some guidance notes around it, but I think obviously for yourselves as the employer and employer representatives of this, I think it's quite a critical move in how the fund is trying to interact with its employers and moving forward on that side. So I'll stop there, Sean.
People got any questions on the policy or any comments they wish to offer?
I think it's just more for my understanding on the approach of setting contributions, because it sounds like there's a risk to the fund because they would have a cap. The contributions are not aligned to the triennial valuation. So I think it's just more for my personal understanding to understand the risk.
Okay. So fundamentally, there is no risk to the fund because the liabilities will still remain with the awarding authority. So as an example, I'll try and make sure this. So a contractor, the way that we're approaching this is a contractor will be given a set percentage to pay for the length of that contract. So let's take that as for instance, as 20%. So they will pay 20% for the life of the contract. Those liabilities, when we do the actuarial valuation, that cohort of individuals and their liabilities will be calculated alongside the awarding authority. So whoever actually set that contract out. So in the case of yourself, it would be those people would be cohorted within there. So if it was found that actually the fund needed 20.5% for that cohort of individuals, that 0.5 would be captured within the contribution rate of the academy or the awarding authority as part of their secondary contribution rate. So ultimately, the experience is actually captured within and we've dealt with. So the fund, everything is being still treated the same, because ultimately when that contract ceases, all those liabilities in theory would pass back to yourself as an awarding authority anyway. But basically what you're saying is I'm taking responsibility for those. So actually the risk more is on the awarding authority, because they are then taking whatever the market risk, shall we say, and the market movement of the assets and the liabilities of that particular contractor. Now, what you will more than likely find is that what the actuary will do is set a degree of prudence that may be different to the awarding authority in terms of the contribution rate that will be set. So what we're anticipating will happen is, as part of the actuarial valuation, all employers will then be given a rate that will apply to any contracts that they will then award for the next 3 years. So you'll be given your own contribution rate, but then also every employer will then be given a rate that will then be applied if they then put a pass-through contract in place. So what that will mean is that in 12 months' time, if a contractor goes, I'm going to go out to tender for a cleaning contract, you can, as part of that process, go to any of the incumbents. You will be expected to pay X amount for the length of the contract. What that should mean is that the awarding authority, because there's more certainty, the awarding authority should get a better quality bids, because the contractors will know what their obligations and their costs will be for that period of time.
Okay, thank you. No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Has anybody else got any questions or comments on the fund's preferred approach? No?
From me, nope, none from me.
People are happy to note the report?
As I said, from the fund's perspective, we will be issuing guidance out to all of the employers imminently with regard to the preferred option. So it will give all of the employers on the fund information about how the preferred option is now available to them and what they need to go through to actually implement that as well.
Right. Okay, that moves us on then to the last item. Andrea, do you need me to read the wording?
If you could please, Sean, and then if we can just pause there just so I remove the recording bot. Thank you.
Okay. So that in accordance with section 100A4 of the Local Government Act 72, the public be excluded from the meeting for the following agenda items, because it is likely that if members of the public were present, there would be disclosure to them of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A to the Act, and that the public interest sorry, I had a pop-up come across my screen. Public interest in withholding information outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information to the public.
Thank you. Do you all agree to exclude the press and public? Agreed? Thank you. Okay, if you can just pause there for a second and I will come back to you.